Hey guys, welcome to HokuProps. This is Chad Hoku, and today I'm going to show you how I made Sammy a custom modded computer case. One of the things I find absolutely important whenever you're doing this kind of thing is to just get familiar with the components you're going to be disassembling. If you kind of forget how you took it apart, it's going to be way harder to figure out how it goes back together. One of the things that I find help most in this kind of build is to actually get one of those magnetic screw holders. And what's so good about this is you can just kind of drop your screws in there. You don't have to worry about losing them. You don't have to worry about just like, where's all the screws when you go put it back together? So just keep track of that stuff. Now, something you're going to see me use a lot in this video is actually a power drill. And I just want you to make sure that you're extra careful that you're not stripping out any of the posts or screws. Now you can see me kind of going through just trying to get familiar with how they assemble this whole thing, trying to figure out the best way to disassemble it to make sure I don't break things, because that's something that you're always going to be prone to, is just these plastic pieces breaking. Now this area I need to be extra careful. There's tempered glass and I want to make sure I don't break it, because that can not only hurt me, but I can't really replace it if it breaks. You can also see I'm just trying to be extra careful when taking this part out. Now on the bottom of this front panel there's a dust grill. So all I'm going to do is bend these tabs back. That's what keeps it in place. And once you're done with that, it should just slide right out the front. At this point the front panel is completely disassembled. Now I'm going to take the screws as well as any of the little parts, I'm going to put them in bags and tag them, and that way I can keep track of what goes where and I don't get just confused. Alright, so now we've got the top section of the case, and this one is assembled somewhat similar. The only major difference is you've got more dust grill and no glass pieces to worry about. Just like on the front panel, all you need to do to take these grills out is to carefully bend the tabs up, and then once they're straightened out, it should just fall right out. Another thing I'd recommend doing is once you've successfully taken them out, look at them and see if the tabs are straight. If you can straighten them out even further, it's going to help later when you're trying to reassemble everything. I was having a hard time bending up some of these tabs, and I even had a couple of them break. So once again, just be careful, and that being said, you might have to get a bit creative to be able to lift them up. I think at one point I ended up getting a hooked pair of pliers that were really thin that I could just kind of like finagle underneath there. I think I also was using like some clay sculpting tools too, but really whatever works that's not going to, break and cause damage. This next piece I'm taking out is just held in there by some tabs that are held by pressure. And so just bend them outwards, flex them a little bit, and then you should be able to just pop it right out. Our next step is going to be to just sand any surfaces that we're planning on painting. For this I'm going to be using a 1600 grit sandpaper. That's going to give me a nice surface for paint to stick to without really creating deep surface scratches that are going to show through the paint. I like to cut my sandpaper into squares and fold it over several times. What this does is this gives me a thicker piece to hold on to. It allows me to control the sandpaper better and more accurately, so I'm sanding the parts that I want and not making as many mistakes. You also want to make sure that you get the edges and little nooks and crannies of whatever you're sanding. These edges are typically where the paint will actually start to lift off if you're not sanding them properly. So just make sure that you get everywhere that you need to. I feel like this is a good point to kind of talk to you guys about paint and how it works. The reason why it's so important to sand the surface of whatever you're going to be painting is actually because when paint starts to dry, it actually will contract a bit, it'll constrict. And so when you sand that surface, as that paint is actually constricting, it's going to grab into those tiny little micro abrasions and micro cuts and grooves that you're making with the sandpaper. This is what actually causes it to stick. If you've ever painted on a surface that's really smooth, like glass or something like that hasn't been sanded, you might have noticed something called orange peel, and that's basically when the paint is constricting but doesn't have something to grab onto. So once again, just make sure that you guys give anything you're working on a really nice light sanding to make sure that stuff is going to stick and you're going to have success. It's super important when you're painting to make sure that you use a surface prep chemical agent. What this does is this breaks down any oils from your fingers, as well as just something that might have naturally been on that surface. This is going to help your paint stick, it's going to help minimize any reactions, so on and so forth. Also, this should go unsaid, but make sure you allow the actual surface prep chemical to fully dry before you start painting. The color scheme is going to be a Tiffany blue and white. Those are Sam's favorite colors. So for painting, I start by just doing a really nice light coat. I'm trying to see how good of coverage that we're getting with this paint, and B, it's also just shooting a light coat like this is going to give us some extra surface for that paint to adhere to as we do subsequent coats after this. You can see I'm really not trying to build the paint up really heavy. Instead, what I'm trying to do is just get a nice even coat. Now, I want to explain why this is important. When you're working with paint, they've all got solvents in them. So when you put a light coat, the solvents are able to evaporate properly and they're able to allow the paint to fully dry and fully cure. When you put a really thick coat on there, it'll develop a skin. That skin will harden, but the interior of that paint is going to have a bunch of solvents that can't evaporate through it. This prevents the inside from fully curing. So just make sure that you go light and not heavy. Again, I'm just going to start by using a cleaning agent, and then we're going to switch over to using the next color, which is the white. Now, when you're working with paints like Rust-Oleum that have a high oil content, make sure that each layer you give additional time for curing. This paint, it's very durable, but it takes forever to cure properly. And so the best thing that you can do is just do really light coats and just let it cure in between those coats. Typically anywhere between 20 minutes or so between each coat, I've found to really benefit the overall finished product. Now, we're all kind of tempted to touch paint and see whether or not it's cured. And so all I can do is recommend that if you're going to check this paint and see if it's dry, do it in the back, kind of like I just did there. Now, we've waited about 2 days, we've let all of the paint dry, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and I'm going to start carefully reassembling pieces. This includes, the grills, this includes all of the different panels. I'm just trying to make sure that what we've got here I'm happy with, because let's say a color doesn't work, it's not too late to kind of go through and make some changes. Now, something that I would recommend for reassembly like this is if the paint isn't dry, oftentimes you'll accidentally get a fingerprint in there before you realize that the paint's not fully set. Now, one thing you can do is you can put some gloves on, and this will help minimize any sort of issue you might run into. But realistically, just make sure you don't rush the paint. Give it enough time to really properly cure. You can see on this part, it just drops right in. And that's because earlier when I first disassembled it, I checked and I made sure that all of those tabs were nice and straight. Now, I'm going to try to be really careful while screwing these in, but I can tell you right now that I actually broke like 3 or 4 of the posts. But if something like that happens, it's not the end of the world. If it really comes down to it, a little bit of glue goes a long way. Now you see that I'm using my drill here, but what I want you to make sure you realize is each power drill has what's called a chuck on it, and that chuck, oftentimes you can set the actual tension on it, or the torque. And so if you set that torque at 1, it's going to have very, very little amount of torque able to act on the screw, and that's going to prevent you from stripping stuff out. So just make sure you turn the chuck way, way, way down. Now you can see me using glue because stuff broke. This is Sam's old computer, and something I have to warn you about is she's never cleaned it. Now, one thing that's kind of fun but I forgot to record is the heatsink for her RAM. I actually took the blades off of them and painted them to match the case. You can see the matching green in there. Now, to finish this whole build off, we're going to create a custom engraved side panel for her case. And in true Sammy fashion, it's going to be a Corgi. We did this on our 110 watt CO2 laser cutter. And there we have it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please hit the subscribe button below. If you're curious about any of the tools or equipment or the case we used in this, check out the description below. That'll have links to all the different things that we were using.